All right, welcome. In this video, I want to get started on showing the basics of how we're going to build our game by sharing a little bit of my base code that I'm going to share with you that you can use to start building your own game, mostly because this same code is going to be used by any web-based game, or at least something like this. And the first thing I want to talk about is called the Asset Manager. And the Asset Manager is going to manage our assets, and our assets in this case are going to be our visual and maybe later on our audio assets. Those are the images and then the sounds that we might want to play within our game. Now typically in a normal web page, you would just make an image tag on your web page, and then that would download the image. And I talked a little bit about that in the last video. It would trigger an asynchronous download, and when those images would arrive, would be undetermined, or would be determined rather by maybe their size, some network properties and so on that might determine how long it takes them to download. Now, with our game, we're not going to necessarily do that, and that's going to be for a couple of reasons. And one of those reasons I want to take a look at right away, which is I'm going to just jump over here to my GitHub. This is again the GitHub for my Super Marriott Brothers that we were just looking at there. And we can just take a quick jump into the sprites. I'm not using all these sprites right now. When I get to my finished version, I'll probably cut these down to just the ones that I'm using. But these are all of the different sprites that I have chosen to download and use in my Super Marriott Brothers at the moment. So maybe I'll just take a look at one of them. I know one of them right now, Marriott Dead. We can see this. Maybe I'm going to zoom in a little bit. We can see that that's the image of Mario when he dies, and it's just a single image, and that's normally what we would expect for an image, which is just one image. So if I wanted to show Mario dying, I could do that here. Now I'm going to go back here and take a look at one of my other ones. So that's uncharacteristic Mario Dead. If we look at Mario, well, here is Mario with all of Mario's forms, including Mario Dead. I don't know why I have Mario Dead on a separate one. That's probably one I'm going to have to eliminate, or one I'm going to want to eliminate later. Now, why do we have all of Mario's forms on one image? Now, there's a couple reasons for this, and in the past, the historic reason for this is that it would be simpler to store this all in memory as sort of one chunk, one map. However, in a more modern sense, why would we want this all as one image on the web? Well, instead of having to, say, for instance, name every single one of these images, this looks like him, Mario idle, Mario walking left, step 1, Mario walking left, step 2, and so on. There would be so many images, we'd end up with maybe 100 images just for Mario here, and we'd have to download them all. Now, this might not be a problem if we were doing this all on our machine. If this wasn't a web-based thing, we could load 100 images pretty quickly. But the problem with downloading them all is, remember, each one of these would trigger its own download. Due to the overhead related to the networking costs of downloading the images, it's actually going to be more advantageous for us to stick them all in one big image like this, and then download the one image at once. We'll only have one overhead instead of 100 overhead. And so that's one of the main reasons why we might want to lump all of our images together onto one sheet. This is now what we might call a sprite sheet. Each of these images we might call a sprite, and then this would be a sheet with all of the sprites on it. So if you're looking for images, 2D images that you can use in your own games, usually the first step is to go and do a quick Google for sprite sheet. And so for here, I actually did this Super Mario Brothers sprite sheet. Let's maybe click it down to here. And if you're eager, you can just go jump on images, and you're going to see a whole bunch. Now, the problem with jumping on, maybe we see the one that I found here, but jumping on here, all of these might not be the best. Some of these are not going to be in the best format, because really what we want, and you'll see here that this is probably what we want, sprite PNG. Now this will give us PNGs. Now why do we want PNGs? I'll talk more about this when we get to our animation video, but it's usually because they've got transparency in the background, and that's really one of the key things that we want. And so again, I might find them here. Now actually I'm just going to go back to all, because I think I actually went and found one of these, maybe Mario Universe, and downloaded my sprite sheets from there, or maybe this Spriters resource. Usually what I'm going to do is, yes, a Google is a good way to start, but there are some good sprite websites out there that you might want to find, especially if you know exactly what you're looking for. Maybe you want, Link from The Legend of Zelda, then there's definitely going to be a site out there that has that already for you. Otherwise, if you're just curious, you don't know what you want to do, you want robots, I might just type robot sprite sheet. You want dinosaurs, dinosaur sprite sheet, see what you can find. Sometimes it's a little time consuming to do that. But again, the goal here of having those sprite sheets is to have all your animation frames all on one sheet. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to animate them in a future video, in a couple videos from now. But right now, I want to talk about just downloading the sheet. Now again, the main way we would do this on a website would just be to make an image tag and have it appear. But the thing is, we don't want this image to appear anywhere, ever. We want to grab little chunks of this image and paint them when it's the appropriate time. And because of that, what we really want is we want to download this image, keep it in memory somewhere, but never display this whole image. We'll only ever be displaying parts of it. So we'll only ever keep the whole image in memory. And why do I say we're keeping it in memory? Because when we ask memory, hey, I want just this chunk, then we'll be going and grabbing the big chunk and then finding the little chunk that we want and taking it out. And so the purpose of this video, the goal of this video, is to show how we're going to download all these images and then store them in memory somewhere convenient for us to access them at the end. And the actual tool or the code that we're going to use to do that, if we go back to the base, here is the AssetManager. And you'll notice here, just from, this is my Super Mario Brothers again, the AssetManager here was from my first commit. I haven't changed it. And again, there's actually two reasons for this. One is I stole this AssetManager from Seth Ladd, as I mentioned in my last video. Seth Ladd actually wrote this code, and I actually just modified it by translating it into ES6, since he wrote it before ES6 was released. But when I submitted it, I haven't had to make any changes to it since then. It's basically, and once you use it, this is why I'm sort of providing this as base code. You can download it too, and then you can just use it probably unchanged. But you might want to know how it works, and so that's what the purpose of this video is. How does this actually work? So let's see if we can make it work. Now again, this is my main web page, but here is the actual console output from the Super Mario Brothers. And what you'll see here is there's a lot of output being generated here by the AssetManager. And that's because actually one of the only pieces of console.log that I still have in my base code, a lot of my other ones I've either commented out or I've just deleted altogether. This is some code I've just left in my AssetManager that basically just logs what's happening in the AssetManager. And so this is the output of the AssetManager. Before we look at the code that actually does it, I'm just going to demonstrate sort of the flow of control that we've got in this particular piece of software. What we're going to do is we're going to start out by telling the AssetManager which PNG images I want to download. You'll notice not all the ones in my repository are downloaded here. These are the ones I think I'm actually using at the moment. Even some of those might not be used either, but I anticipate they are. I'm not using Luigi, for instance, at the moment because I haven't built Luigi in to my current version. But here on line 10, at least, of my AssetManager, we'll go check it out, is when we're generating this line of text that's telling us when we've started queuing the download. So basically that means this is where we've added them to a queue where they're ready to be downloaded, but we haven't downloaded them yet. Okay. Next, we have, this is when we start the download. So on line 25 is when we're going to trigger and start the download. And the one thing you'll notice is the order that we trigger the downloads is also in the same order that the downloads were requested. Now we get to our loaded. This is my local directory here. That's where I'm loading it from. Normally this would be loaded from the web if this was my web one, but this is my local instance that I've been testing this morning. And so this is showing you the order in which they were actually downloaded. And again, I mentioned this earlier, that when we trigger these downloads, these are asynchronous downloads. So all of these triggers, when I triggered Mario to download, immediately after that, the next operation maybe even, I trigger this download to download Luigi, but in so doing, I'm not waiting for the first download to end. The first download has started, and it's going on a different process in the background, but I'm now starting Luigi, and then I start enemies, and then I start tiles. So all 8 or however many there are here are all going at the same time, and then I get signals as those downloads finish. And now what I've done is I've set up a listener, and a listener listens for the download, saying, when you're done download, I'm waiting for you, and when you send me the message that says you're done, I will do something. And one of the things that I will do, this is line 28 of Asset Manager now, is I will output what I have downloaded. I will state what has been downloaded, and in this case, the first thing that was downloaded, in this case, they were all loaded properly. If there was an error, I would get an error message here. But the first one that was downloaded was bricks. And this is interesting, and I'm glad that this comes up, because it just shows that this is the asynchronous part that I'm mentioning. Just because we triggered Mario first doesn't mean Mario will be the first one that's loaded. Now, why was bricks loaded first? I don't 100% know the reason why, but if we go take a quick look back at our images here, I'll take a look at bricks. Bricks is pretty small. Bricks only has it's a short little small image. It's 433 bytes. And maybe I'll just jump back again to Mario, and we see that Mario is 6.43 kilobytes. Okay, so Mario is considerably larger as an image than our the bricks, and so that's why the bricks seemingly has appeared first. So again, bricks appeared first, then Mario, then Luigi. Looks like the rest came in order, except for that bricks that came out of order. Now, one of the reasons for that is I'm loading this into memory from, well, where it lives on my hard drive. And that is a much quicker and easier and less error-prone activity than loading something from the internet. Loading something from the internet, we have to deal with the channel. If the channel was a bit noisy, meaning we lost some packets along the way, we might have to resend those packets. That means we might have to resend the whole image if it ends up showing up and it's broken. And so as a result, there are different things that might trigger different reasons why they might be out of order. Here, the ordering tends to match the order that we requested them in, partly because I think most of them are relatively the same size, but bricks, being the smallest one, it sort of jumped itself to the front of the queue. Now this is showing the output, what we've done. Now I want to take a look at how we got there and what is the code that we've produced to get there. And so as I've mentioned, this code is produced by one class that's included in the Super Mario Brothers code that I've provided there, and it's called the Asset Manager. And the Asset Manager is a very, very simple class, and so I'm just going to show you how we do it. Now, it's simple in its design and its construction. However, it has it uses a lot of the JavaScript features that I mentioned in my previous video, that if you're not familiar with JavaScript, you're just familiar with Java or C++, might be a little bit tricky. So I'm gonna at least take time to mention each of them. So first of all, this is our asset manager, and it comes with its constructor. Now remember, our goal is we're going to queue some downloads, then we're going to trigger the downloads, and then we're going to listen for those downloads for when they arrive, and then we're going to do something. So the thing that I'm going to set up in my constructor here is just the basic variables that we're going to need to keep track of that. And the one that leaps out to me here is the download queue. This is where we're going to add to all of add to this list all of the images that we want to download. And at the moment, I'm initializing this just to an empty list. Okay, what about our other ones here? We're also going to have the cache. The cache, which of course here is representing a form of memory. This is where we're going to load the images when we've downloaded them so that we can access them later on. So anytime we want to access them later on, we're going to go and reach into the cache and find them. Okay, and then we've also got our success and error counts here are just going to be some helper variables along the way that's going to keep track of whether we've made a success or we've made an error relative to these downloads that we've tried to trigger here. Okay, so this is going to be our initial constructor setting up some of the base variables. Now, when we want to queue a download, we're just going to call this method called queueDownload. And you're going to see it takes one argument here, which is the path. Now remember, in JavaScript, we haven't really said what types are. We have weak typing, which means we might want to think to ourselves, well, what is this? Well, path is typically going to be a string. And remember, the default of most types is going to be a string. If you don't know any better, it's probably a string. But in this case, it's going to be an actual string depicting the path of the image that we want to download. Now, why would we select that? Why not just give it its name or something else? Well, the path is how we're going to actually trigger the download. We need to know its path to know where it is to fetch it, to get it. Okay, either to fetch it from our own machine if we're doing it locally, or more likely to fetch it from the website that actually has it. We need to know where on that website it is, so we ask that website by giving it the path of the file that we want. Now, we're going to take advantage of that because that path is the string. That's how we're going to identify our images in the Asset Manager. Now, if you don't want to identify your images by the path, then you can give them unique names if you like, and you can update your own Asset Manager or change this Asset Manager as you like. Now, I'm just using the path because it's the easiest, and you'll notice inside this queueDownload, the first line is just that console log that we saw the output from just now, which is queuing each of the files one at a time. Okay. The only other thing that we see here, using the normal list syntax for JavaScript, which is using a push, we're going to push into our download queue each of these paths, remembering that these paths are strings, so this is going to be ending up being a list of paths that is a list of strings. So I want to just take a quick aside here to look at my main. Everything else we can ignore. All the other code that I have here is not relevant to this. It's just the main at the moment where I'm going to be triggering these downloads. So you can see here, this is a pretty simple main. We make a game engine, that's my next video. But in this video, we're looking at the Asset Manager here. And we see we've created the Asset Manager. I just called it Asset Manager. Now notice I used all caps here. That's because I'm going to be fetching it again later, and because it's clogging my game space, or sorry, my global space here, I'm going to, I usually use as a naming convention all caps for global variables, but that's just, that's my naming convention. Go ahead and use your own. I've called it Asset Manager, and then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to queueDownload for all of the images that I want to download. So you can see that for each of the different images. And remember, I was storing my images in this sprites folder. And so instead of just being ./mario.png, it's ./sprite/mario.png. So that will navigate into that folder to fetch it for me. And that's just because usually when you start building your game, you're going to have numerous sprites. You don't want them clogging out a folder, so you just build your own folder for them. And for the same reason, you sometimes do that with your JavaScript files as well, or maybe multiple folders. Now, the reason I wanted to jump over here is, again, just to see a little bit how we're going to use the Asset Manager. After we queue the download, we're going to call this function here, download all. Now, again, if you're a non-JavaScript programmer, this sort of design pattern here might look a little bit weird. We're calling this function download all, but we're passing into it this function, which is this whole function that goes all the way down to here. Okay, that whole function is what we passed into download all. Now, here we need to think about a couple of design patterns that are built into JavaScript. First of all, this is sort of a normal functional programming kind of a design pattern where you pass a function into another function. Now, why would you ever pass a function into another function? Well, usually the reason is you want to call that function at some point. Okay, and you want to use that function at some point. So in this case, we want to use this function at some point inside download all. Now, when do we want to use it? We want to use it when we're done downloading them all. Okay, this is called what is sometimes called a callback function. A callback function. A callback function is a function you want to call back when you're done the current function that you're calling. So we're calling download all, which, as you might expect, is going to download all of our images. And when it's done, we want to do something else. And I'm not going to look at in here too much. I mean, you can take a look here. This is other stuff, but this is my real main. This is called main.js here, this file. But this is my real main down here that's going to start my game up. But the reason I'm passing the real main as a function into the download all function as a callback is because I don't want to start the game until I've downloaded all my resources. And that kind of makes sense. Okay, you could probably start the game before you downloaded all your resources, but you'll probably end up with broken or non-existent images if you try and draw them, or maybe just errors, crashing altogether. Okay, now of course, to avoid that, we're going to wait. We're going to download all, and we're going to wait until everything is downloaded, and we're going to then call this main. And this main I'll talk more about in my next video when we start talking about the game engine. The game engine is the next topic. So we're going to do a download all here, and that download all, now that we've sort of realized how we kind of want to use it, we want to use download all to download all, probably. We haven't really said how we're going to do that yet. But then when we're done downloading them all, we want to run this function. So this function is going to be our input, or our parameter that we pass here, and we're going to call it when we're done. So let's go back to the Asset Manager here, and now we'll take a look. I'm just going to look at download all for a second here. Download all takes as an argument something that I'm calling callback, and that's going to be the name of that function that we pass in. Okay, anytime I call download all, I could pass in a different function. But the only time I actually do call download all is here in main, and I only ever pass in this main function. So I could use it for other things. So you could use it, for instance, to pass in your main and do something different than what I'm doing with my main. Okay, and that makes it a little bit more versatile. Okay, now let's take a closer look at what we're going to do inside the download all, because again, this callback that we've used is already one JavaScript design pattern that's sort of unique and maybe new and different. There's going to be a couple more packaged in here. We're going to have some listeners, and we're going to trigger some downloads, and we're going to make some what are called image tags. Now, this first line here, I want to just mention, because this wasn't in Seth Ladd's version, but I've added it as an extra line in my version because sometimes, rarely, but occasionally, I want to call this Asset Manager download all when I'm downloading 0 things. It's kind of weird. Why would you want to do that? Why not just jump right into your main? So I've actually added this, and this is a little bit of, a little bit hacky. Okay, but what it's saying here is if you call download all and my queue length is 0, instead of crashing or doing something else, I'm just going to immediately call my callback. Okay, and here, why didn't I just do like I did down here, callback with the actual method call? Instead, I did set timeout, which remember we talked about at the end of the last video, will delay, in this case for 10 milliseconds, the callback. And this is where the hacky bit is. Here I'm just delaying 10 seconds to make sure that, or 10 milliseconds rather, to make sure that the HTML document has already loaded. And the normal way to do this, the correct way to do this, and maybe I'll point this out, is in our main here where we've got this this hand-built asset manager that's going to do the downloads and then tell us when it's done, we can actually ask the window to tell us when it's finished loading the document. And that's probably what I should have done instead of this little hacky line here. But that's because I just use this asset manager sometimes when I'm downloading no images. And that's because I use it as a simulation. I use this game engine and this core code for simulations in my research that don't have any sprites in it and don't have any game elements in it. But you probably don't need this line. You can even delete it out if you want, or fix it if you want, make it a little bit better. The code that we're actually going to be using is going to be down here in this for loop. And this whole for loop is, as we can see here, is going to loop through our download queue that we had filled up previously. So remember, we fill up the download queue by calling queue download, and now let's imagine we're doing it in Super Marriott Brothers. So we've got these 8 images that we've queued up, and they're all in there by their path. So the first thing that I want to do is look at this line here. This line here, line 21, is where we create an image tag. Okay, an image tag, or in this case, we're creating a new image. This is built into JavaScript. And what this does is build an image tag like you would have that would appear on the web, in the HTML document. Okay, and again, if you're familiar with HTML design, that would be you're making an image tag itself. If you're not familiar with HTML design, what this is meaning for our purposes is this is going to trigger the download for that image. Actually, at this point, we don't trigger the download because it doesn't know what to download yet. Okay, here we were just saying, hey, make an image. It's kind of empty at the moment, but once we tell you what to download, then download it. Okay, so at the moment, let's think of it as an empty image, an empty package waiting to get something to download. All right, now I want to go into another piece of JavaScript peculiarity, and this has to do with the this. Okay, the this, I've talked about this before. This, or in the last video, this is a normal operator that's supposed to refer to the current instance of the class or the current object. So we have a class which is Asset Manager, and this should refer to the current instance of Asset Manager, as you would expect, as this reserve word is used in all kinds of different languages. However, in JavaScript, a class is just a function. So if you use this inside of a function that is not attached to a class, this download all is attached to the Asset Manager. It's a method function of Asset Manager. So within the scope of download all, this refers to, again, as we would expect, the current object or the current instance of Asset Manager. However, when I go inside this function now, wait for a second here. This function we haven't got to yet, but this function is another callback function of the one that we just looked at in our previous example. This function has no name, right? It's defined on the fly, okay? And inside this function is not attached to the Asset Manager. So inside this function, this refers to the function, not the current instance of the Asset Manager. And so what that means is if we were going to use this in here, say we wanted to do this line here, this dot success count +1 or plus, that would not end up incrementing the success count in my Asset Manager like I want. It would increment a success count in this function. This function doesn't have a success count, so this would probably trigger an error. Okay, if you started writing this in your own, you might say, can't increment something that doesn't exist or an undefined, in which case you might puzzle yourself and say, well, gee, that doesn't work. I don't want it to increment the success count of this function. I want it to increment the success count of the current instance outside. And so what that means is inside JavaScript, you have to end up doing this weird design pattern that happens a few times, where we're going to define a var that equals this. Now, some people call it that, some people call it self. I call it that just because I copied it from Seth Ladd, I guess, or whoever was the first one who taught me how to do it. So I call it that, but if you've learned it to be self, you can call it self as well. And what that does is give us a reference. Now, that is equal to this. So outside here, outside this function, when we set this up, we made a new variable that's really just an alias for this. Outside here, we don't need to use it because we can just use this. But inside this function here, we still have access to that. So we will go ahead and access that, which is equal to the current instance of the asset manager. So again, this is a little bit of a bizarre example of a design pattern in JavaScript, but it's one that, once you see it a couple times, you will get familiar with it. And then certainly once you have the first error where you run into this, where this isn't referring to what you want it to, you will have your first problem. Okay, so let's take a look at, now that we've got that set up, let's see what we can do here. The next bit is, this is the next line where we've got this console.log, right? This is that one that's going to tell us now that we're going to trigger the download of this image. So remember, we've already got 8 console logs when we queued the output here. This is where we're going to start downloading. Now, we're not going to actually start the download yet. At this point, we're just storing the path, which is our the current path that we're looking at. And remember, here is where we output it, but this is non-functional. Other than outputting to the console, it doesn't do anything. But what we're going to do now is this image that we created up above here. Maybe I'll jump to the bottom. Down below, the SRC here, SRC, if you're familiar with a little bit of HTML programming, the SRC is the source of the image that you're supposed to download. So in the image tag, you usually set the SRC to be equal to the path of the image. So what we're going to do here is, on this line down below here at least, we're going to take that path that we stored above, and we're going to make the current image's source equal to the path. When we do it, this line, line 39, this is what triggers the download. Okay, before this line, we had an image, but the image didn't know what it was, what image to download. Once we tell it what to download, that will tell your browser to go, oh, this is the image I'm supposed to get? Do I have it? Okay, I don't. Usually at this point, it knows it doesn't. So it will say, ask the server for that image. So it will use that path that you just gave it to go ask the server, please give me this image, and it will download it if it doesn't already exist in your cache. Okay, so it will download it. And remember, that download is asynchronous. So just because this line triggers the download doesn't mean that this line finishes the download. The download does not finish here. It's just started up. And in fact, we end up going through this whole for loop, and we get to the next image and maybe trigger this line again for the next download and the next one and so on, before maybe the first download ever finished downloading. Okay, now what is this stuff that's going on in between here? These are listeners that we have to set up before we trigger the download, because before we trigger the download, if we want to be ready for when it's finished, we better set up those listeners before we even start it. Why? Because the download might be very fast. The download might be very fast, especially in the case where there's an error. Maybe we ask the server, hey, give me this image, and there's no such image. That response might come very quickly from the server, so we better be ready to listen for those responses before we trigger the download. So up here, before we trigger the download, we're going to add 2 different listeners to our image. We're using this function called add event listener, which will build in a listener for certain events that might happen to our image. And these are built in to JavaScript. You can jump over on the Mozilla Developer Network to see what kind of events might be triggered for an image. 2 of them are load, what is triggered when it is loaded, and the second one is error, what is triggered when it is errored. When there is an error, I guess that's a better way of saying it. So an error might be triggered for any number of reasons, but the load will happen if it is successfully loaded. And usually that's what we're going to expect and what we want. So let's take a look at what happens. When the load event happens, after we've triggered the download and that image is coming back, the load event will occur. Then this function, this callback function here that we've made here, will be called. So what does it do? A console log. Okay, we saw the output of that log, which is going to tell us that we've now loaded the function. Notice that's different than the error loading message that we might get below here if there was an error. Okay, and this is just what's going to help us know the difference between whether we've successfully loaded or not. Now the second thing we're going to do is we're going to increment our success count in the case here of a success, and down below we're going to increment the error count in the case of an error. Okay, in both cases afterwards we're going to do this interesting last line, which is if we're done, so we're calling this extra helper function that checks to see if we're done, then we will call back. Now remember, callback was the input method. So we got some parameter given to us as input. That's going to be a callback function we expect. That's why we called it callback. That's this word callback is a signal to JavaScript programmers, meaning this is probably a function. Okay, meaning whatever I'm going to do with it down below here, I should probably use it like a function. So here I'm using it like a function. I'm going to call it back likewise here as well. Okay, here we're kind of using it as a function as well, but we're going to use it as a function to call only when we're done. Now, when are we done? Are we done after one of our images is loaded? No, our goal was to be completed after all of our images were loaded. So we're actually going to make a special little function here, is done, which I guess is up above here. We skipped over it. Let's take a look what happens when we call is done. Well, what is done is going to do is it's going to compare the length of our queue, that's how many images we're supposed to download, to the number of successes and errors. And you might say, why do we include the errors in there? Don't we just want the successes? Well, if we only can include the successes and we got an error, then we would hang. The asset manager would never say it's done. Okay, and we want it to be done once it's tried to download all of the images. If some of them have failed, we want it to say it's done, and then we can handle that error afterwards if there was an error. So here we're just saying if we've got as many successes and errors that all put together, added together, is equal to the length of our download queue, then we're done. Okay, then we're done. So normally, and most of the times, if you're successful, that will just mean this will be all of your successes and zero error count added together will be your length. If you're done, if that was the last download, that means the first download that is downloaded, we'll call this, and that won't be true. Same with the second, third, and so on until we get to the last download. Then it will be true. That means we only call callback once at the end after we've downloaded them all. And that's when we want to. That's when we're done. All right. That's pretty much the asset manager, except there's this one last little bit here, get asset. And I haven't really said how to use it yet, but this is what we use after we're done. Now that we've downloaded all, I guess I skipped this line too. That's an important one too. After we trigger the download, we'll take that image that we've created and we'll put it into our cache. Where in our cache? This is the interesting part too. Again, I borrowed all this code from Seth Ladd, so all these design patterns are part of what he used, and I think this is pretty standard. He's going to use the path, the string, that is the path, as the index into our array. And remember, this is one of the weird things you can do with JavaScript, but just make sure you know what you're doing. Here we're using the array or the list as a map, which is technically what it is. It's a map. And so we're going to use the strings as the identifier of the image. That is the path as the identifier of the image. And that means if we ever want to get that image later, we need to know its path. Okay, so we're using that path basically as the image's name. All right, and now what that means is now that our cache is set up with all of our images stored in them according to their path, whenever we want to request an image, we'll just call AssetManager.getAsset, give it the path that we want, and it'll just return that image. So remember, stored in that location will be this image that we've created. Okay. Now the interesting thing is, remember on this line, line 39, we triggered the download. Line 40 is the exact next line. At this point, the image probably hasn't downloaded. It's still empty. It has the source tag. It's probably waiting. But later on, when we call it, hopefully we don't call get asset until this download all is finished, right? That's the point of the download all, is that when it's done, we call the callback. That's when we're ready to call get asset, because that's when the images are fully downloaded and stored in the cache instead of some empty wrapper. Okay, and so again, hopefully it will. Let's just take a quick look. I'm trying to think what's a good one. Let's go to Mario. Ooh, Mario's got a lot of stuff in him, but the one thing that we see here is where we use Mario. Actually, I guess I use Luigi here too. Okay, Mario. If Mario, then we'll use AssetManager get asset, and you can see here we're using the exact path for the Mario sprite sheet that we wanted to use, or the Luigi sprite sheet in this case here, that we triggered on our download in our main, which was right here where we triggered the Mario. Same exact path used to download it and then to access it and get it. And usually what we're going to do, and this is just foreshadowing now for the next couple videos, is when we want to use that asset now, we'll use it once by fetching it from the asset manager and storing it again with a different name. Usually I call it sprite sheet in wherever I'm using it. In this case, I'm using it inside my Mario class, which is the controller for Mario. Okay, so I think that's all we need to know about the asset manager. And usually, if you want to, you can use it sort of out of the box as is. Take the version I have here, just understand now how to use it. You've seen how to use it with the main, and use it as is. The only changes you might want to make to it are, well, fix this line if you think this is a little hacky. Go ahead and do that. But I haven't set it up yet to download audio assets. And audio assets will operate very similar. You'll have a path for them, and you're going to want to fetch them and so on. And then once you have those audio assets, you want to store them in a cache as well. So all of the design patterns that you will need to use are exactly identical to what I've already got here in the Asset Manager. So if you want to upgrade this to download audio as well, just practice what we just talked about here, upgrade it for audio as well, and test it once or twice to make sure it's working, and then you've got audio working in your game as well. All right, well, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in that next video.